Meze have updated their $2,000 closed-back flagship headphones, and now they've got wood. So let's check them out. The original Lirics were the first headphone Meze produced between their $300 99 Classics and their $3,000 Empyreans. But unlike both of those headphones, they had portable pretensions. They were closed-back headphones, they had a more subdued design, and of course they come, like the new Lyric 2s, with a carrying case. However, probably the only drawback is they aren't foldable, so that was kind of a negative. But let's talk about the actual design. Like the old ones, the new ones are pretty much the same externally, except they have this piece of ebony wood on the cups, and that means each individual pair of headphones will have a slightly different design. This is actual wood on here. Some people have asked originally if the 109 Pros actually had wood, and yes, they actually use wood. And so, although it probably with the heavy coating on there, it does feel rather maybe more like plastic. It can be confusing. I mean, even magnesium can feel like plastic at times if it's heavily painted. So, but yes, that's actual wood on there, and that gives maybe upgrades the style slightly with these. Although one thing I liked about the originals is that the subdued design meant that other people didn't really know that you were wearing a very expensive pair of headphones, although there were maybe slight hints, but you kind of got the idea because, like the old ones, the new ones have this really nice kind of designed attachment where the rod's attached to the yokes of the headphones, so that as you're putting them on, you see this nice, copper design, and you see that you're wearing a pair of expensive and well-designed pair of headphones, but other people around you don't get that kind of hint, although now maybe they do slightly more because of the ebony on there. But one of the major changes to the design that people have been asking for is now the earpads are removable. They're magnetic. Now, the problem with having removable earpads on a pair of portable headphones is that they could possibly fall off and you could lose them, although you can, of course, buy replacements. The other thing is, as closed-back headphones, if you don't get a good seal between your ear and the earpad, then you can actually lose a lot of bass. To that end, they have designed a double foam ring system where you have one foam ring on the earpads and another on the inside of the cups, and that should provide a sufficiently good seal. And you can also buy replacement earpads, although they are a little bit expensive. But I mean, if they last a few years and then you buy a new pair, that isn't too bad overall. The other cool thing I noticed is that the earpads have little holes in them, and that means as you push them, any air that's inside them gets pushed through these holes and into these holes that match in the cups. So you don't have an issue of, pushing them into your ears, pushes air onto the drivers and maybe move the drivers. That won't happen, I guess. But it does seem that they have very heavily engineered the design of these, but more so that you can actually disassemble all the headphones and replace and repair them readily. Now, one other thing that, before I get into one other change about the Sonics, is that the cable. Now, if you're probably familiar with Meze, you'll know the cable, but the cable they sent me was this 3.5 millimeter plug terminated cable. On the other end, they have also 2-pole 3.5 millimeter plugs, which means they're readily compatible with aftermarket cables and even original cables from companies like Focal and Hi-Fi Man. So you have a lot of options there if you do want to use aftermarket cables. This cable is kind of rather rubbery and not particularly my favorite, but obviously it will make the upgrade cable considerably more attractive. Okay, but one of the main things, and you probably noticed this, especially since it has been previewed online already, is it's called the QWRM, and I've forgotten what the meaning of that acronym is already, but basically the tuning of the Lyrics was something that not everyone was particularly happy with. The problem with closed-back planar magnetic or closed-back orthodynamic headphones, to use their proper terminology, is that when you suddenly close the back of these, you lose a lot of mid-bass, and that makes them sound very thin, and it did with the Lyrics. That's always been the case back from the original LCD XCs, which I think were the first of the new round of closed-back high-end planar magnetic headphones. So to that end, what Meze have done is covered over 6 of the holes in the magnet with this to damp, they say, frequencies around 7 kilohertz. But overall, the tuning has changed. So let's take a break and then talk about my sound impressions, not just of these headphones, but I plugged them into, a lot. And I got some interesting thoughts about that. Let's talk about the original lyrics a little bit. Now, they had a kind of, I suppose, a signature that was a little bit more exciting because of the lower bass. That, of course, brings out more of an emphasis on the upper mids and treble, but that could be somewhat fatiguing. And I probably describe the mid-range or upper mid-range as a little bit etched. So it was a little bit hard, a little bit harsh, but still I found them to be very detailed headphones, which very much reveal the different sound signatures of different gear I plugged them into and the different levels of resolution I could hear. So there was a distinct jump from, lower end, say a dongle DAC, up to some of the high-end gear behind me. However, the sound signature, again, a little bit on the thin side, so that made listening maybe not as pleasant as it could be, especially when you have portable headphones, you take them out and about. Any outside noise that does come in is going to be most noticeable as interfering with the treble and upper mids and is going to make the overall sound a little bit harsher. For portable gear, I much prefer a sound signature that is somewhat warmer and darker, even if it's a little bit dark of neutral. Now, Meze described the sound signature of the new lyrics as being more balanced, and I actually think that is a very good description indeed. Initially, if I jump from the original lyrics to the lyric 2s, it sounds like the treble has been somewhat muffled, but after 30 seconds that impression disappears and it actually sounds more natural with slightly better instrument timbre than the original. In an overall sense, it still has the punchy bass of the originals, and that means it works well as an all-rounder with everything from classical through to modern music, which can be a lot brighter and a lot more kind of aggressive. Some examples here, I wrote some notes for myself. John Lee Hooker's Serves Me Right to Suffer. This is a pretty good recording that I like a lot. Now, the original lyric is very sharp and punchy here, but ends up being somewhat fatiguing, even out of something like a tube amp like the Studio 6 behind me. Now, the lyric 2, again, when I switch to it, seems a little bit duller on switching, but, again, that impression disappears after a few seconds, and John Lee Hooker's voice seems a little bit further back than it was with the original lyrics because that upper mid-range seems to be pushed back a bit, and the overall sound is thicker, and after a minute it becomes less intense and a lot easier to listen with. But jumping to something like a kind of, I don't know if we call this classical music, maybe along those lines, as Lee Ritenour and Dave Grusin, and I hope I pronounced those correctly, an album called Two Worlds. And these particular guys are very good at producing movie soundtracks. So that kind of album sounds like a kind of 70s, 80s movie soundtrack. Not quite as exciting as today's Hans Zimmer kind of stuff, but you kind of get the impression. It's a really nice recording. Now, the lyric has a nice crisp treble, but again, it becomes fatiguing after a while. It becomes a little bit, the mid-range, kind of the instruments become a little bit grating, and then there's an etched sound. But the lyric 2 seems to fix that in that it has a little bit of that typical Meze sound where if you look at, say, the graph, and I talked about this in other videos when I was reviewing, say, the E3s, that maybe around the 2 kilohertz mark is a little bit more pulled back, I'm guessing, without actually having seen a measurement graph, compared to, say, a particular Harman target curve. And again, not everyone likes the Harman target curve, and I think that slight pullback at 2 kilohertz actually works very well with making the sound seem a little bit more spacious without pulling the vocals so far back like you had, say, with the Sennheiser Drop HD8XX, which pulled back that 2 kilohertz area far too much and made it sound like you're listening in a tunnel. Pulling it back a little, and I think these probably have that Meze sound of being very slightly pulled back at 2 kilohertz, makes for an overall nice balance, although it does darken the sound of instruments very slightly. And maybe that means it doesn't have the most perfect timbre, but it makes them very easy to listen to, especially if you have something that is kind of very aggressively recorded as well. Now, Thievery Corporation, and a track I really like called Music to Make You Stagger. And it's a really punchy track, which is a lot of fun. It works well when you're listening to it through, say, warmer gear, because it is a more modern recording. It's a mixed recording, and brighter headphones end up being fatiguing far too quickly. And that's a good opportunity to talk about listening with different gear. And also, I did some EQing on them to see how they performed, and also how they compared to Dan Clark Audio's E3s. Now, I'm going to do a separate video on comparing these to Dan Clark Audio's E3s. I was going to do one with the original lyric, and then Meze contacted me to say they had a new one coming. So let's talk about, first of all, how they compare with different gear. Now, like the original lyrics, they are very revealing of gear quality. Now, handy thing about them is that they are extremely sensitive, so they will work with a wide variety of gear. Actually, I initially listened to them for fun plugged directly into my MacBook Pro, although that doesn't really get loud enough to, if you want to turn the volume up, you can easily hit maximum even with very sensitive headphones like these. Now you can get software to kind of boost the volume output, but that wasn't quite ideal, although the performance was still very good and you still got decent bass. If you have something like, well, I have dongle DACs like, for example, this Luxury and Precision W4. This is an excellent dongle DAC. It has excellent measurements. It's a very clear sounding model, and I could listen to this in high gain at around the 86 mark, say with Thievery Corporation. The only downside to these dongle DACs is because they have to power out of a phone or a tablet, they are limited to how much current they can draw, so you can very easily hit maximum volume, especially with less sensitive headphones like the E3s, but with the Meze Liric 2s, even with, unless I'm listening to, say, very quiet classical, which has high dynamic range, that kind of music, you're going to hit a volume limit with these. But more modern music, which is not so, well, has maybe less dynamic range, but is closer to maximum volume, maybe somewhat compressed, does work very well with something like this. Now, but for preference, I preferred something warmer. For example, the good old RU6 from Cayenne. And this, of course, if you haven't already seen my review of it, is an R2R ladder dongle DAC, which is very unique and has a kind of warm, old school R2R DAC sound signature. I kind of preferred that with the lyrics, and it maybe I felt was a slightly better synergistic match. Similarly, because they are very sensitive, they work well even with very inexpensive gear. You can probably just see on the stack behind me, I have a niche Magni Piety, and I also have the new Modi Multibit in here, which I'm in for review as well. That little stack I found was really great with stuff like the 109 Pro, and similarly it is also great with the Meze Lirics because they're very sensitive and you still get the very punchy bass that they have even with this lower powered gear, whereas that you don't get the punchy bass out of, say, the E3s because they're less sensitive and they require more overall power. So that's one of the advantages that the Lyrics do have as portable or transportable headphones, is that you can plug them into anything and still get a decent listen. Although I'd probably go better than, say, something like the the USB-C or Lightning dongles that you get with Apple iPhones or some headphones. I'd go with something a little bit better, again, like one of these dongle DACs. But all the same, they still do scale well into higher-end gear. So, for example, I've got the AUN S17 amp in there, and it has a slightly warmer sound signature. You've probably seen my GSX Mini review, and in the end I found synergistically I liked the sound with these slightly warmer amps than I did with maybe the slightly colder stuff, say straight out of a Hugo 2, although straight out of a Hugo 2 is very good. Or say, for example, anything colder sounding straight out of the TT2 and M-Scaler stack that I have. I preferred the warmer stuff, the Audio GD R2R, GSX Mini, which has a warmer sound signature, Shit Audio's Jotunheim, they produce a lot of very punchy sound too, it's very good value, and also the S17. Now, one disadvantage I think they have is that the small cups do kind of restrict the overall sound a little bit. I wouldn't use the word congested ever with it. Probably a little bit more crowded sounding than some of the higher end models. You've got of course, Meze's own Empyrean, etc. But you also have the Dan Clark Audio E3s. Now, as a quick comparison to those, they have the advantage, of course, that they compact a lot better. For example, case in point, pun intended. But as they are less sensitive, they are harder to drive out again. They'll max out a dongle DAC, you're always getting up to maximum volume. Things like the Magni series are going to be kind of sound constrained, whereas they're not going to with the Meze Lirics. However, one thing that the E3s do better is they have a more spacious sound. They allow more space for individual instruments to come through, especially if you turn up the volume, whereas the Lyrics tend to end up sounding crowded. And this can be an advantage and a disadvantage. If you're listening to very punchy music, again, like Thievery Corporation, like I was, then the Lyrics can make that more fun, whereas the slightly more kind of refined and open sound of the E3s can be a little bit more boring in some respects. But when you're on higher end gear, then the better refinement of the E3s show through, especially if you have more powerful amplification, like I have a whole bunch sitting here. Then that's where the E3s will have the advantage, such as if I plug them into my Schiit Audio Mjolnir, or again the S17 there. Now that's a good opportunity to talk about EQ. Now personally I was never a fan of digital EQ because of the degradation of the sound that you get, but I actually have a Schiit Lockyer sent to me by Jason Stoddard, and actually I'm very impressed with that. But I thought it's a good opportunity to see, and I'll talk about this more in probably its own review video, of whether I can make various different headphones slam. And that basically means turning the two left-hand dials up to maximum and see what happens. And with some music, you can get some interesting results. With some headphones, you can make them really slam. Like, you don't want to always, but let's say you have something like Dead Can Dance, and if you haven't checked out Dead Can Dance, it's really, really interesting music. Not so well recorded, and maybe not enough bass in the recording. I mean, I wish whoever did Jack Johnson's recording and mastering did Dead Can Dance, because then it will be way more entertaining. But that's the kind of music where you really want to jack up kind of the low bass and the mid bass and just have your headphones slam. And a lot of good headphones will respond to it. You can do some crazy stuff like make HD800Ss slam, but that's the video for that time. With the Lyrics, that was where they hit their proverbial wall. Now, if you take the E3s and you jack up the left-hand two dials on the Lockiest, you can make them slam very easily. But if you jack up the mid-bass dial on the Lyrics, then the bass just becomes, well, it just doesn't work. I don't even know how to describe what happens. Boomy is not the right word. It doesn't go out of control. It's like it's overdamped. So it's like too much in control. And that's probably the limitation of these, is they don't EQ up a lot of bass well. I mean, if you're using EQ to turn down the treble more, or maybe turn up the mid-range a bit more, that might be all right. But yeah, they're only going to slam as much as they do with the default tuning, which, again, I'm going to agree with Meze that they are more balanced and good all-rounders, even if they don't have the ability to really slam when you really want heavy bass. Try again. So overall, I think that the new Lyrics are definitely an improvement on the original. The more balanced sound signature definitely makes them very good all-rounders, especially considering with their sensitivity, they can be plugged into anything and you can get a good listen. The only disadvantage they have is I wish they were foldable, because as they have portable pretensions, this case is pretty large as things go. Although designing a good portable, folding hinge system, well, that is definitely going to be a challenge if the Meze ever get around to doing it. But if you don't mind carrying something that's quite so large, especially if you're the kind of person who just carries full-size luggage anyway, these are really something that I could readily take with me if I was carrying a large suitcase, chuck in a dongle DAC into the case as well, and that would make for a nice portable listening system, and that could be very enjoyable while sitting in a hotel room on those days when you're not going out anywhere, or for a bit of a listen before going to sleep. They aren't going to be as isolating, obviously, as a pair of noise-cancelling headphones, but they're still going to be something that should be usable, maybe even on an airplane, especially if you're lucky enough. If you can afford these headphones, maybe you can afford business class tickets, and sitting forward of the engines is always going to be somewhat quieter, especially if you can get on a 787 or A350. Now, at this point, I normally ask people who own the headphones to post their impressions below, so that, because I like my videos to be useful, and the more impressions people get from actual users means the more information people can use to decide whether to buy or not to buy these headphones. Now, you can buy these headphones through the links in the description, and that will help support my channel. But also, if you do buy a pair, please do come back to this video and post your impressions after some use. I recommend running them in for a few days, say on some pink noise like I did, and that will ensure that what you're hearing is what you're meant to be hearing from the headphones. Also, if I haven't posted them already, some of the devices mentioned in this video, such as this W4, S17 and others, will be in future reviews, and I'll also be doing a separate video about the Lyric 2s versus the E3s with some more detail. So do hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when those are out. And if my video was helpful to you, do consider buying me a coffee. If you become a member, then you also get to join my Discord and chat to me directly, and you'll see my early impressions of new products as they come out, or things I have in for review before I actually review them. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.